The year was 1581, and within the stone walls of Moscow's most sacred fortress, a sound pierced the November darkness that would haunt Russia for centuries. It wasn't the clash of enemy swords or the roar of cannon fire. It was something far more chilling, the anguished wails of a father who had just murdered his own son with his bare hands. The man responsible for this unspeakable act wasn't some deranged peasant or foreign invader. He was Ivan IV, Tsar of all the Russias, the absolute monarch of the largest empire on earth. And the young man whose blood now stained the Kremlin floors was his firstborn heir, the future of an entire dynasty. What drove a ruler to commit the ultimate act of familial destruction? How does a prince become so consumed by rage and paranoia that he would destroy the very thing he spent his life building? The answers lie buried in a childhood so traumatic, so filled with betrayal and violence, that it forged one of history's most terrifying monarchs. This isn't just the story of a single moment of madness. This is the dark chronicle of how absolute power, when combined with unhealed wounds and unchecked fury, can transform a human being into something monstrous. To understand the man who would earn the title terrible in the truest sense of the word, we must journey back to his beginnings. Back to a time when young Ivan was not the perpetrator of violence, but its victim. Back to the moment when the seeds of his future monstrosity were first planted in the fertile soil of childhood terror. August 25th, 1530, marked the birth of Ivan Vasilievich in the heart of the Russian Empire. But even his entry into this world was marked by omens of the darkness to come. Court chroniclers recorded that his mother Eleanor endured excruciating labor pains that lasted for hours, her screams echoing through the palace corridors, while Orthodox monks chanted desperately, believing that demons themselves were trying to prevent the child's birth. Perhaps they were right to be concerned. Ivan's father, Grand Prince Vasily III of Moscow, was already an aging ruler when his son was born. The weight of governing the expanding Russian territories had taken its toll, and by the time Ivan reached his third birthday, disaster struck the royal family. Vasily developed a severe infection in his leg, and despite the desperate efforts of court physicians who applied gruesome remedies, including poultices made from human flesh, the wound turned gangrenous. Young Ivan was forced to witness his father's agonizing final days, watching as the man who had seemed invincible writhed in pain and gradually succumbed to the spreading poison in his blood. The death of Vasily III in 1533 left 3-year-old Ivan as the nominal ruler of Russia, but real power fell to a regency council dominated by the boyars, Russia's hereditary nobility. These men, who should have protected and guided the young prince, instead saw his minority as an opportunity to advance their own interests and settle old scores. Ivan's mother Eleanor became the primary regent, but she found herself surrounded by enemies who viewed her authority as illegitimate and her foreign heritage as suspicious. For 5 years, Elena fought desperately to maintain control over the regency and protect her son from the schemes of ambitious nobles. She navigated a treacherous landscape of court intrigue, where alliances shifted daily and trust was a luxury she could not afford. Young Ivan watched his mother's constant state of anxiety, seeing her surrounded by guards at all times, holding whispered conferences with advisors about threats both real and imagined. The palace that should have been his sanctuary became a place of fear and uncertainty. When Ivan turned 8 years old, the fragile stability his mother had managed to maintain came to a brutal end. Eleanor was found dead in her chambers, her body contorted in unnatural positions, her lips stained black with what court physicians suspected was poison. Though no one was ever officially charged with her murder, it was widely believed that she had fallen victim to one of the many boyar factions that had grown tired of her interference in their plans. With Elena's death, Ivan became a true orphan, surrounded by men who saw him not as their future sovereign, but as a useful tool in their quest for power. What followed was perhaps the most formative period of Ivan's life, and certainly the most traumatic. The boyars, no longer restrained by any parental authority, began treating the young prince with a mixture of public reverence and private contempt that would shape his understanding of power forever. Two main factions emerged among the nobility, the Świecki family and the Bielski family, each determined to control the child and, through him, the Russian state. During the day, Ivan was forced to participate in elaborate court ceremonies where he was dressed in heavy ceremonial robes and required to stand motionless for hours, while foreign diplomats and church officials paid homage to him as the divinely appointed ruler. These public displays reinforced the idea that he was chosen by God to rule, that his authority was absolute and sacred. But when the ceremonies ended and the public eye turned away, Ivan's reality became something entirely different. At night, the same nobles who had bowed before him during the day would enter his private chambers and ignore his presence completely, discussing state business as if he were invisible. They helped themselves to the royal treasury, wearing gold-embroidered robes and dining from silver plates that had belonged to his father, while Ivan and his younger brother Yuri were left with inadequate clothing and often went hungry as punishment for minor infractions. The hypocrisy was staggering and deeply scarring. Ivan would later write about these experiences, describing how he and his brother were treated like beggars' children by the very people who had sworn oaths of loyalty to their father. The young prince learned that those who claimed to serve him were often the ones most eager to exploit his vulnerability. He witnessed the theft of his inheritance, the mockery of his authority, and the complete disregard for his basic needs as a human being. The psychological impact of this treatment cannot be overstated. Ivan was learning that power was the only protection against cruelty, that appearances often masked the darkest intentions, and that trust was a dangerous luxury he could not afford. These lessons would prove catastrophic for Russia and for Ivan himself in the years to come. As he grew older, the abuse became more systematic and deliberate. The boyars would beat him for trivial offences like spilling food during meals or speaking out of turn during religious services. They delighted in humiliating him, forcing him to perform menial tasks, while reminding him that despite his royal blood, he was completely dependent on their mercy. This treatment created in Ivan a deep-seated need for absolute control and a pathological fear of betrayal that would define his entire reign. But perhaps most dangerously, the constant brutality began to awaken something dark within the young prince. Deprived of normal childhood experiences and surrounded by violence and cruelty, Ivan began to find pleasure in inflicting pain on those weaker than himself. He started with small animals, throwing cats and dogs from the high walls of the Kremlin and watching with fascination as they met their deaths on the stones below. This wasn't mere childhood mischief. It was the beginning of a pattern that would escalate throughout his life, as Ivan discovered that causing suffering gave him a sense of power and control that nothing else could provide. The boy who had been made to feel helpless was learning to make others feel the same way, and he was finding that he enjoyed it immensely. The transformation from victim to predator accelerated as Ivan entered his teenage years. By the age of 12, his experiments in cruelty had evolved beyond simple animal torture into something far more sophisticated and disturbing. He began studying the different sounds his victims made as they died, categorizing their cries with the methodical precision of a scholar. The same intellectual capacity that allowed him to memorize vast portions of religious texts was now being applied to the mechanics of suffering. The boyars, consumed with their own power struggles, failed to recognize the monster they were creating through their neglect and abuse. They saw only a sullen, withdrawn boy who posed no immediate threat to their schemes. This was a catastrophic miscalculation that would cost many of them their lives in the years to come. Ivan's first public display of the violence brewing within him came during a heated council meeting in the Kremlin's Grand Hall. The ornate chamber, with its walls lined with religious icons depicting saints and martyrs, seemed an unlikely setting for what was about to unfold. The boyars were engaged in their usual bickering, treating the young prince as little more than furniture, when something inside Ivan finally snapped. Rising from his throne with deliberate slowness, Ivan fixed his gaze on Prince Andrei Shwisky, one of the most arrogant and dismissive of the nobles. His voice, when he spoke, carried a coldness that silenced the entire room. He accused Shwisky of betraying his father, his mother, and now conspiring against God's anointed ruler. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. What happened next shocked even the violence-hardened courtiers. Ivan ordered his guards to seize Shwisky, and when they hesitated, uncertain whether to obey the commands of someone they had grown accustomed to ignoring, Ivan's rage exploded. His voice rose to a roar that echoed off the stone walls as he reminded them exactly who held the power of life and death in Russia. The guards finally moved, dragging the protesting Shwisky from the hall while the other nobles watched in stunned silence. But Ivan wasn't finished. He had prepared something special for this moment, something that would send an unmistakable message about the new reality of his reign. Outside the palace, a pit had been prepared, and within it waited a pack of dogs that had been deliberately starved for days. Prince Shwisky's screams as he was thrown to the savage animals could be heard throughout the Kremlin complex. Ivan watched from a balcony above, calmly sipping mead from a golden goblet as the man who had tormented him for years was torn apart by the ravenous beasts. When it was over, he turned to face the terrified nobles who had witnessed this display and delivered a message that would define his reign. Anyone who defied the will of God's anointed sovereign would meet the same fate. This wasn't an impulsive act of teenage rebellion. It was a carefully calculated demonstration of power designed to shatter the illusion that Ivan could be controlled or manipulated. The traumatized boy had discovered that fear was the ultimate currency of authority, and he intended to be very wealthy indeed. The psychological impact of this moment on Ivan himself was profound. For the first time since his mother's death, he felt truly powerful. The terror in the eyes of the men who had once treated him like a beggar's child was intoxicating. He had found his weapon, and he would spend the rest of his life perfecting its use. In January of 1547, at just 16 years old, Ivan staged a coronation ceremony that broke with centuries of Russian tradition. Rather than allowing the Metropolitan to place the crown upon his head, Ivan crowned himself in the Cathedral of the Dormition, declaring that his authority came directly from God and required no earthly intermediary. This act of defiance against established protocol was another clear signal that the rules which had governed previous reigns would not apply to him. The early years of Ivan's official rule surprised many observers with their relative moderation. Influenced by advisors like the priest Sylvester and the nobleman Alexei Adashev, and stabilized by his marriage to Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan launched a series of ambitious reforms. He established Russia's first representative assembly, modernized the military, codified laws, and even founded the country's first printing press. This period of constructive governance seemed to suggest that the violence of his youth might have been left behind. Ivan participated in lengthy religious services, undertook pilgrimages on foot to distant monasteries, and engaged in theological debates with learned clergy. His marriage to Anastasia appeared to provide the emotional anchor he had lacked throughout his traumatic childhood. But this peaceful interlude was built on fragile foundations. The reforms, while beneficial to Russia, did not address the fundamental psychological damage that had been inflicted on Ivan during his formative years. The capacity for extreme violence remained dormant within him, waiting for the right trigger to reawaken it. That trigger came in 1553, when a catastrophic fire swept through Moscow, destroying vast sections of the city and leaving thousands homeless. An angry mob, incited by boyars who saw an opportunity to strike at Ivan's maternal relatives, blamed the Glinsky family for the disaster. Ivan's uncle, Yuri Glinsky, was lynched on the very steps of a cathedral. his body torn apart by the furious crowd. The symbolism was not lost on Ivan. Once again, those closest to him had been destroyed by the very people he was supposed to trust and protect. The fire and its aftermath triggered a spiritual crisis that sent him into deep seclusion, convinced that the destruction was divine punishment for some unknown transgression. When he emerged from this period of isolation, those who knew him best noticed that something fundamental had changed in his demeanor. The final transformation came in 1560, when Anastasia died under circumstances that Ivan found deeply suspicious. He became convinced that his beloved wife had been poisoned by boyars who were jealous of her influence over him. In his grief and rage, he ordered her doctors to be tortured until they confessed to their supposed crime. His anguished cry that, "They stole my angel, my only light in this world of demons," revealed the depth of his emotional dependence on the one person who had managed to keep his darker impulses in check. Modern historians generally believe that Anastasia died of natural causes, possibly tuberculosis or another disease common to the era. But Ivan's paranoid mind could not accept such a simple explanation. Someone had to be responsible for taking away the only source of stability and love in his life, and he was determined to make them pay. When Ivan returned from his period of mourning, those who encountered him were struck by the change in his appearance. His eyes, always watchful, now seemed to search every face for signs of betrayal. His movements had acquired a predatory quality, like those of a hunter constantly alert for threats. The man who emerged from grief was no longer the reforming Tsar who had modernized Russia. He was something far more dangerous. The year 1565 marked the birth of Ivan's most terrifying creation, an institution that would transform Russia into a landscape of systematic terror. He announced the division of his empire into two distinct territories, declaring that while most of Russia would continue under traditional boyar administration, a vast section including Moscow itself would fall under his direct and absolute control. This new domain, which he called the Oprichnina, would be enforced by a personal army unlike anything the world had ever seen. These enforcers, known as the Oprichniki, rode through the Russian countryside like harbingers of apocalypse. Dressed entirely in black and mounted on black horses, they carried grotesque symbols of their purpose: severed dog heads tied to their saddles and brooms attached to their stirrups. The meaning was unmistakable. They would sniff out treason like hunting hounds and sweep away Ivan's enemies like refuse in the street. But these weren't noble knights serving some chivalrous code. Ivan deliberately recruited them from the lower classes, men who harbored deep resentments against the aristocracy and would show no mercy when ordered to destroy their social superiors. The Oprichniki became Ivan's instruments of revenge against a world that had traumatized him. Every humiliation he had suffered as a child, every moment of powerlessness and fear, was now repaid with interest through their actions. They descended upon noble estates like locusts, seizing property, torturing inhabitants, and executing entire families on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. The methods they employed grew increasingly elaborate and sadistic, as if Ivan was conducting some twisted experiment in human suffering. Victims were tied to carriages and torn apart by horses, pulling in opposite directions. Others had their skin peeled away in thin strips while being kept conscious through the entire ordeal. Some nobles were forced to sit at banquet tables and continue eating, while their family members were tortured to death mere feet away, the screams of their loved ones mixing with the sounds of clinking goblets and forced conversation. Ivan himself would sometimes attend these macabre feasts, observing the psychological torment with the detached interest of a scholar studying an interesting specimen. The Tsar's personal participation in these atrocities revealed the depths of his psychological transformation. After one particularly brutal execution, witnesses reported seeing Ivan dip his finger into the victim's still warm blood and taste it, declaring with apparent satisfaction that the blood of traitors was sweeter than honey. This wasn't mere political theatre designed to intimidate enemies. This was a man who had found genuine pleasure in the suffering of others, whose childhood trauma had metastasized into something monstrous and insatiable. The Reign of Terror reached its horrifying climax in 1570 with the massacre of Novgorod, a prosperous trading city that had the misfortune of arousing Ivan's suspicions. Based on a forged document that claimed the city was planning to ally with Poland against Moscow, Ivan convinced himself that Novgorod represented an existential threat to his rule. His response was to orchestrate one of the most systematic acts of genocide in medieval history. For 6 weeks, the Oprichnina turned Novgorod into a slaughterhouse. Up to 3,000 people were tortured and killed daily in ways that defied human imagination. Victims were impaled on stakes and left to die slowly while crowds were forced to watch. Others were thrown into the freezing waters of the Volkhov River with stones tied to their bodies, drowning in the icy current while their families looked on helplessly from the banks. Priests were roasted alive in their own churches, their screams echoing through the sacred spaces where they had once offered comfort to their congregations. The treatment of women and children was particularly savage. Nuns were subjected to mass sexual assault before being drowned in groups, their religious vows meaning nothing to men who had been taught that anyone could be an enemy of the state. Children were murdered in front of their parents as a form of psychological torture, their small bodies used as weapons to break the spirits of adults who might otherwise resist. The systematic nature of these atrocities revealed the careful planning that had gone into this campaign of extermination. When the massacre finally ended, fewer than 10,000 of Novgorod's original 40,000 residents remained alive. The city's economic power was completely shattered, its trade networks destroyed, and its cultural heritage obliterated. Moscow's dominance over northern Russia was secured through the simple expedient of eliminating any potential rival. Ivan had learned that the most effective way to prevent rebellion was to kill everyone who might conceivably rebel. But the external violence was merely a reflection of the chaos consuming Ivan's personal life. After Anastasia's death, he embarked on a series of marriages that seemed designed more to satisfy his increasingly erratic impulses than to produce stable alliances or heirs. His second wife, Maria Temryakhovna, died under mysterious circumstances after bearing him a son who lived only briefly. His third wife lasted just days before drowning in what was almost certainly murder. Another bride was buried alive on Ivan's orders when he decided she had somehow displeased him. By the late 1570s, Ivan's body had become as corrupted as his soul. Years of gluttony, sexual excess, and the mercury-based treatments he took for what was likely syphilis had left him a grotesque parody of his former self. His once athletic frame had swollen into obesity. His face had become bloated and discolored, and he suffered from chronic pain that only seemed to intensify his rage. Court physicians documented symptoms that suggested advanced neurological damage, possibly from the very medicines intended to cure his other ailments. The physical deterioration was matched by an acceleration of his mental decline. Ivan began experiencing episodes where he would forget where he was, holding conversations with people who had been dead for years. He would sometimes spend entire days lying motionless in his chambers, staring at the ceiling while muttering incomprehensible prayers. Other times, he would fly into rages so violent that courtiers would flee the palace entirely, returning only after word spread that the Tsar had exhausted himself and collapsed. His relationship with his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, became increasingly strained as the young man matured and began to question his father's methods. The younger Ivan had grown into everything his father was not: thoughtful, measured, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of the Russian people. He had also developed the courage to challenge his father's decisions, a trait that the older Ivan found simultaneously admirable and threatening. The tensions between father and son were exacerbated by the presence of Ivan Ivanovich's pregnant wife, Elena. The younger woman represented everything the aging Tsar could no longer possess: youth, beauty, and the promise of new life. Ivan's obsession with her grew increasingly unhealthy, his behavior toward her becoming erratic and inappropriate, in ways that disturbed even the violence-hardened court. The final act of this family tragedy unfolded on a cold November day in 1581. Ivan burst into his son's chambers and discovered Elena wearing only a thin nightgown, her pregnant belly visible beneath the sheer fabric. Whether she was simply in some imagesting or had been caught in impropriety, Ivan's dicey possible interpretation of what his mind immediately conjured the worst was seeing. His accusations came in a torrent of rage and profanity that shocked even those accustomed to his outbursts. He accused Elena of adultery, of carrying another man's child, of dishonoring the royal bloodline with her supposed infidelity. Before anyone could intervene, he began beating her savagely, his blows targeted specifically at her swollen abdomen, as if he could destroy whatever evil he imagined was growing there. The sound of Elena's screams brought Ivan Ivanovich running to her defense. The sight of his father attacking his pregnant wife triggered something primal in the young man, a protective instinct that overrode his lifelong fear of the Tsar's wrath. For the first time in his life, he physically confronted his father, trying to restrain the older man's arms and shield Elena from further violence. But in Ivan's twisted psychology, this act of protection became the ultimate betrayal. His own son, his heir, the future of the dynasty he had spent his life building, was now defying him. The iron staff he carried, the same ceremonial weapon he used in religious processions, became an instrument of ultimate destruction. The blow he delivered to his son's skull was driven by decades of accumulated rage, paranoia, and the terrible realization that even his own blood could turn against him. The sound of the young man's skull cracking echoed through the chamber, like the breaking of the Russian state itself. As Ivan Ivanovich collapsed to the floor, blood streaming from the fatal wound, the older Ivan seemed to awaken from his rage-induced trance. The sight of his dying son triggered a psychological collapse that was perhaps even more complete than the physical destruction he had just wrought. For 3 agonizing days, the finest physicians in Russia worked desperately to save the prince's life. Ivan refused to leave his son's bedside, alternately praying, weeping, and offering increasingly extravagant bribes to God for his boy's recovery. He promised to build churches, to free prisoners, to end the terror that had consumed his reign. But the damage was too severe, the wound too deep, and on the 4th day, Ivan Ivanovich died in his father's arms. The psychological aftermath of this ultimate act of self-destruction was swift and terrible. Ivan's hair turned completely white within days of his son's death. He began experiencing violent tremors that made it impossible for him to hold objects steady. The slightest unexpected sound would send him into panic, his body convulsing with fear as if he expected his dead son's ghost to appear and demand justice. Court observers noted that Ivan began wandering the palace corridors at night, dressed in rags and muttering his son's name over and over again. He would spend hours lying beside the prince's tomb, refusing food and speaking to the corpse as if it could hear him. The man who had once inspired terror throughout the known world had become a pathetic figure, destroyed by the very violence that had defined his reign. His surviving heir, Fyodor, was everything a medieval ruler should not be: gentle, deeply religious, and completely unsuited for the brutal realities of governing an empire built on fear. Ivan knew that his dynasty would likely die with this simple-minded son, that everything he had built through decades of terror and conquest would crumble after his death. The knowledge that his life's work would amount to nothing added another layer of torment to his final years. The end came suddenly on March 17th, 1584, while Ivan was playing chess with Boris Godunov in his private chambers. Some contemporary accounts suggest he was poisoned, others that he suffered a stroke brought on by years of stress and physical deterioration. His bloated, diseased body was dressed in a monk's robe according to his final wishes, reflecting his desperate hope that adopting religious garments might somehow absolve him of a lifetime of unforgivable sins. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Ivan's story is not the individual acts of violence he committed, but what his reign revealed about the nature of power itself when exercised without restraint or accountability. The traumatized child who had vowed never to be a victim again had become history's ultimate victimizer, proving that those who suffer the most can sometimes inflict the greatest suffering on others. The legacy of Ivan's reign extended far beyond his personal destruction, creating ripples of chaos that would define Russia for generations to come. His systematic elimination of competent administrators and military leaders had left the empire hollow, a facade of strength concealing institutional collapse. The Oprichnina had not merely terrorized the population, it had destroyed the very foundations of effective governance, replacing experienced nobility with sycophants whose only qualification was their willingness to commit atrocities. Foreign observers who had once viewed Russia as a rising power now saw it as a wounded giant, bleeding from self-inflicted wounds. The Polish and Swedish kingdoms, sensing weakness, began probing Russian borders with increasing boldness. The tribute states that had once paid homage to Moscow's strength started questioning whether continued submission served their interests. Ivan's reign of terror had succeeded in destroying his enemies, but it had also destroyed the state's capacity to defend itself against genuine external threats. The economic devastation was equally severe. The massacre of Novgorod had eliminated Russia's most prosperous merchant class, while the constant purges had decimated the skilled artisans and administrators necessary for a functioning economy. Trade routes that had once brought wealth from across Europe and Asia now lay abandoned, their operators either dead or fled to safer territories. The royal treasury, once filled through conquest and taxation, had been emptied by the costs of maintaining the Oprichnina and Ivan's increasingly extravagant attempts to buy divine forgiveness for his sins. Within the Kremlin itself, an atmosphere of suffocating dread had replaced the vibrant court life that had once characterized Russian royal power. Courtiers moved through the palace corridors like ghosts, speaking in whispers and avoiding eye contact with the Tsar, whose moods had become utterly unpredictable. Even the most minor infractions could result in immediate execution, creating a culture where paralysis masqueraded as loyalty. Innovation and initiative withered in an environment where any action might be interpreted as treason. The Orthodox Church, traditionally a source of moral guidance for Russian rulers, had been reduced to a terrified accomplice in Ivan's crimes. Priests who had once dared to counsel moderation now confined themselves to blessing whatever actions the Tsar chose to take, their moral authority sacrificed on the altar of survival. The sacred spaces where Russians had traditionally sought comfort became tainted by association with the regime's brutality, their very walls seeming to echo with the screams of the innocent. Ivan's final years were marked by an increasingly desperate search for meaning in a life that had become synonymous with meaningless destruction. He pored over religious texts, seeking some formula or ritual that might undo the damage he had inflicted on his soul. His donations to monasteries became increasingly extravagant, as if financial generosity could somehow balance the scales of divine justice. He commissioned elaborate churches and religious artworks, hoping that architectural beauty might serve as monuments to repentance rather than repositories of guilt. The story of Ivan the Terrible stands as perhaps history's most chilling testament to how childhood trauma can metastasize into generational catastrophe. The orphaned boy who'd been brutalized by those sworn to protect him grew into a man who would brutalize an entire empire. His desperate quest to never again be powerless transformed him into the embodiment of unchecked power's ultimate corruption. In that blood-soaked moment, when his iron staff crushed his son's skull, Ivan didn't just murder his heir, he murdered his dynasty, his legacy, and whatever remained of his humanity. the terrible irony remains that the man who destroyed so many lives in pursuit of absolute security ultimately destroyed the one thing he truly loved, proving that monsters, even those who wear crowns, inevitably devour themselves.